Could Paulie be a decent Don? As a Sopranos fan, I wonder about this every now and then. To be honest, I think Paulie Walnuts would make a terrible Don, and I'll give you 5 good reasons why. Oh, by the way, if you think Paulie would make a decent Don, be sure to write in the comments. Now, our top kicks off with Walnuts' largest weakness, namely, Paulie Walnuts is a shitty strategist. It is best illustrated by the case between Paulie and Johnny Sack. To put it in a nutshell, Paulie is not happy with the situation while doing time in the penitentiary and believes that the Jersey crew is neglecting his fellow man, Walnuts. My guess is that Paulie expects to get a visit as well as help with the money, but both are his own wishes. In the criminal environment, nobody in their right mind would visit a fellow criminal behind bars. Their chat might be taped and then used against them in a lawsuit. Besides, why attract attention to yourself? You may have seen in the movies how gangsters visit their colleagues behind bars, but in reality, it is extremely rare. Even Johnny Sack, while behind bars, used a relative as a contact between himself and his underlings. Johnny's brother-in-law served as a back channel for communication with Sack. But Johnny is the boss, not just a capo like Paulie. Then why does Walnuts demand to be treated differently? A perfect example, well known to us all, is Henry Hill, co-author of the Goodfellas and the main character of the movie. He was played in the movie by Ray Liotta. So, as Henry says, when you're behind bars, forget about any help from the street. No one will help you. You're on your own. During his incarceration, the only person who cared about Henry was Karen Hill, his wife. She brought him food and various drugs that Henry managed to sell within the prison walls, which allowed him to live a relatively comfortable life in confinement. Well, after Paulie makes a grand move, deciding to whiten the heel of Johnny Sack and Carmine Sr., he begins to leak insider information to New York. This way, he plans to get a position in their family. Some might argue, but he hasn't said anything serious, has he? Indeed, he didn't. Paulie kindly shares Ralph's joke with Johnny Sack, and it almost gets both Cifaretto and Johnny himself dead. Plus, it brings a lot of trouble for Tony Soprano, who has to protect the interests of his men and crew. Plus, through Paulie, Johnny becomes aware of a real estate scam, allowing the Lupertazzi crime family to demand their share. I think if Johnny had pointed the finger at Walnuts, Tony would have arranged to have the mole killed, and that would be that. Besides, it turns out in the finale that Sack has been tricking Paulie the whole time, and Carmine has no idea who Paulie is. Paulie likes to remind everyone that he has a record of military service, that he's such a Rambo, able to find a way out of any possible situation. But the truth, as is often the case, suggests just the opposite. A perfect example is the Pine Barrens episode. Chrissy and Paulie, along with the wounded Valerie, are walking through a snowy forest. This is not a walk between old friends. The Jersey mafiosi want to make a snowman out of Valerie. Despite being clearly outnumbered by the enemy, Valera manages to catch the mobsters off guard, free himself, and escape. And that with a hole in his head. It turns out that Chrissy and Paulie are lost and have no idea how to find their way back. Everything is made worse by the bone-chilling wind and freezing cold. The thugs aren't wearing the right clothes for the weather. At first, Paulie tries to hold his own, but it soon becomes clear that Walnuts is not a tough nut. He whines, complains about everything, blames everyone but himself. Then, when Uncle Paulie loses his shoe, things take a sad turn. Chris gets fed up with it all and quite rightly says, "Uncle Paulie, fuck you!" I'll put it this way. Sunbathing sitting next to the Satrial is one thing, but only when facing problems does a man show his gut, and so it is here. The young and inexperienced soldier Chrissy turns out to be tougher than the hardened old-school capo. Let me draw your attention to the conversation that takes place between Tony Soprano and Paulie in the car. Soprano asks Paulie if he wants to follow up and try again to get on the trail of the Russian Valerie, to which Walnuts grudgingly replies that he has no interest in doing so. It is obvious that Tony expects a totally different reaction. All the more Valerie, if he got in touch with his friend Slava, could ignite a firefight between the DeMeo family and Slava's crew, and that would hardly make Tony any happier. I know that many of the Sopranos fans, like me, are fond of the funny man Paulie. But we are reasoning with you today objectively, so the obvious fact of Walnut's immaturity as a man must be taken into consideration. Paulie is in his 60s at the time of the show. Chris is in his 30s. Nevertheless, Paulie has enough smarts to act like a retard. Think at least of the Adriana Panties incident. Walnuts is 30 years older than Christopher, but when the characters confront each other, it seems that Christopher is a wiser man than Paulie, although Moltisanti is hardly a big philosopher. This theory is best supported by the crew's journey from Jersey to Naples. Christopher throws himself into all sorts of trouble, 24 by 7 stoned on heroin, but nevertheless, it doesn't interfere with the purpose of their trip. Being in the society of his fellow travelers, Moltisanti is discreet and doesn't try to stick his nose in every hole. And he has, mind you, a decent nose. So what about Paulie? To begin with, he behaves like the biggest idiot, trying to follow traditions that are completely alien to him. First, he talks a lot of nonsense during dinner, and then when he hears the word commendatore, Walnut starts repeating it to every Italian in his way, giving the word a meaning of his own. Then he has sex with a prostitute, and when he hears that her ancestors are from the same places as his family, Paulie appears to be ready to marry her. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but I think you know what I mean. Walnut falls in love with Italy at first, but very soon starts to hate it, discovering that it is nothing like he thought it would be. But what annoys me the most is the way Paulie behaves in the company of his colleagues from the Camorra. He's worse than a child asking his parents to buy cotton candy. Tony and his crew arrive in Naples to set up a shipment of stolen cars, in other words, to make some money, not to fool around in the countryside. And Paulie, in fact, is fooling around. He gives the Sopranos no breathing space, now and then asking silly questions at the most irrelevant moments. The way he behaves suggests that he is not aware of the significance of their journey, which once again highlights his immaturity and lack of competence. Paulie Walnuts is excessively impulsive. Paulie is one of those kinds of people who do things first and think later. As we know, such a pattern promises trouble. I suggest recalling the senseless murders or messes to which Walnuts is involved. First of all, the situation with his mother's friend springs to mind. Paulie attempts to steal the old lady's life savings, and when she catches him off guard, he comes up with nothing better to do but to get rid of the grandma. I find that horrible and pathetic. Can you imagine Tony Soprano stealing Carmela's father's life savings? I personally don't. Another victim of Paulie's is a waiter who is unhappy with the tip. I understand that he was able to piss off a mobster, but why murder him? To attract the attention of random bystanders and the police? Or to go to jail for first-degree murder? A stupid and rash thing to do. Well, let's not forget the Russian Valerie who stood in icy water up to his balls. I am not saying he is dead, as his body has not been discovered and Paulie's car miraculously vanished. But let's remember, who is to blame for the situation with Valera? Of course, Uncle Paulie! From the very doorstep, Nut begins to crack jokes about rubles and other cranberries, and then deliberately provokes Valerie, dropping the interior designer's console. In fact, though, the bandits only needed to take Valerie's debt to Sil, and on top of that, Valerie kept the money and was eager to pay back the debt. In the end, Moltisanti and Walnuts barely managed to get out of it. I talked about Christopher's moral anchors in my previous video. Well, Walnuts has no moral anchors whatsoever. In the end, Paulie breaks the most important rule of the mafia. Every single member of the organization is obliged to give money to the boss. When Tony is on the border of life and death, Paulie refuses to give some of the money to Carmela, arguing that Soprano's life hangs on a string, and Walnuts sees no point in paying money to a 5-minute widow. Had the truth come out after Tony's recovery, Paulie would have followed Pussy into the witness protection program. Worst of all, Tony considers Paulie a friend. But as it turns out, for Walnuts, the best friend is money. If he puts his personal interests ahead of his family's, how will he behave when he becomes the boss? Let me answer this. He'll rob all his underlings to the bone. Tony, for all his faults, is not a bad manager, capable of leading the family and making sure that everyone in the family benefits. If Paulie gains control, however, he will become a purely self-interested dictator, which will most likely create a rift within the family and later lead to Walnut's demise. Most prominent example from real life is Carmine Galante, who was feared and hated. The famous Lefty Ruggiero from the movie Donnie Brasco noted that Galante takes everything for himself, ruling based on his own interests, which would eventually lead him to lose confidence in all his subordinates except the Zips, the Sicilian mafiosi. Ironically, it is the Zips who will help plot the execution of their patron in the finale, and Galante will be replaced by the more savvy Philip Rastelli. If Paulie does gain power after the death of Tony Soprano, the best-case scenario is that Walnuts becomes the personal Frito for New York. He will do their orders, trying to ingratiate himself with his masters, and the Jersey crew will lose their autonomy as a result of his reign. As the saying goes, Paulie never had the makings of the varsity Don. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to Vano VHS and hit the like button.